look out.
Surging up from the depths of the sea.
Horrifying, mysterious creatures whose attack on people sends the whole countryside on an endless search.
Unless something is done and done quickly.
Is this the end of our civilization?
You'll pioneer with us the perilous descent into the unknown.
What does that mean? What are you even talking about?
A deep, penetrating dive.
In the last calm and reflective moment, before the monsters came.
Humanoids from the deep dive.
Welcome to the new podcast, Humanoids from the Deep Dive, where we dig deep into the meanings and contexts of your favorite monsters and monster movies. Each episode will see guests and myself give our take on an important movie, monster, and or film, and what we think it means, using everything from history and philosophy to films and folklore. Future episodes will also have recommended films and readings for the interested viewer. Today's episode's a little different than the episodes that follow, being the first one. We're going to dig into monsters and their ability to carry meaning more broadly, something they've always done from cave paintings to Gilgamesh to today. Fans of the show can find us on Spotify and iTunes and follow us on Twitter at HFTDD. I'm your host, Jeff Ewing. I'm an entertainment contributor for Forbes on genre film with Bylands and Nightmare on Film Street and Shudder's The Bite. And I've co-edited 2 books on monster media, Alien Philosophy and Stranger Things in Philosophy, as well as having written book chapters on topics like the devil, hell, Cloverfield, Frankenstein, Jurassic Park. If it's monsters, I'm obsessed with it, and I've probably written about it. I'm especially pleased, though, to introduce 2 excellent guests for our first episode. Sezin Koehler is a multiracial Sri Lankan American scream queen and Frida Kahlo devotee who spends her time writing about film and TV. She's a regular writer about horror and genre topics on Looper and is a film critic for Black Girl Nerds. She's also an accomplished novelist, including the excellent postmodern feminist horror novel American Monsters and the noir urban fantasy crossover crime Rave. Welcome, Sezin.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So glad you're here. And then W. Scott Poole is a tenured professor of American history at the College of Charleston, South Carolina. He teaches popular courses on America and its monsters. He's a regular contributor to PopMatters.com, an international magazine of cultural criticism, and is the author of several books, including Monsters in America, Our Historical Obsession with the Hideous and the Haunting, and Wasteland, The Great War, and the Origins of Modern Horror. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jeff. It's great to be on the first episode. The first of many, I'm sure.
Yeah, I really had to think deep for who do I want ideally on my first inaugural podcast episode, and you 2 are awesome. I'm a big fan of your work.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm so honored. Thank you.
Yeah, me too.
So to start off, what made you both interested in monsters and their sort of history and meanings? Sezin, maybe you start?
Okay. Well, so for me, I think identity had a lot to do with it. Being multiracial. So my mom is a white American. My father's from Sri Lanka, but I actually grew up all over the world since my mom worked for UNICEF when I was growing up. And so for me, it was always I related with monsters because they were outsiders and they were these kind of liminal figures who didn't really fit in anywhere. They looked different from everyone else around them. And I felt a lot of camaraderie with them. And then also like moving around a lot was very traumatic. So I think for me, horror movies became kind of a weirdly like a safe comfort place. And then of course, like just having the monsters there who I identified with so much, it was something that stayed with me my whole life. And like monsters are my oldest friends. That's something that I've just I felt like that since I was a little kid. And also I should add that I was watching horror movies way before I should have been. But so like my entrance to horror though was Medusa in Clash of the Titans. Oh, and I mean, wow. Gosh, I saw that movie when I was like, I must have been 3 or 4. And I just remember that moment so vividly, seeing her, and I wasn't scared of her. I did not find her scary. I thought she was the most beautiful person that I had seen in this hybrid monster. So, I mean, for me, that's where it started. And I was living in Africa at the time. So, yeah, so just put that all together. Being in Zambia, watching Clash of the Titans, and falling in love with Medusa.
Love it.
It's my origin story with monsters.
Perfect. What about you, Scott?
Well, I identify with it, at least the idea of monsters being my oldest friends. I was kind of the this is going to show my age, but that's okay. I was kind of the tail end of the Monster Kids phenomena.
Okay.
And so actually my introduction to monsters was Saturday afternoons, which in my rural South Carolina community, that's when Shock Theater came on, the Shock Passage, the Shock Package that had started back in the 50s and 60s and was still around in the late 70s and early 80s. And so, you know, as a really strange thing where, you know, I was getting to watch everything from the classics like, you know, Frankenstein and Dracula to you know, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, you know, and not really at that time, you know, making much aesthetic distinction but between the value of these things. But then just a lifelong horror nerd. I mean, you know, by the 80s, I had pretty fully graduated, or as my parents saw it, degenerated into a you know, a Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers fan in particular. And so it's something that's always been with me. And I, you know, after becoming an academic and jumping through the hoops that academia makes you jump through, and finally being able to work on the things I was interested in, you know, I started just kind of wondering, like, is this something that can be a field? Is this something that I can write about, you know, as a university professor, and maybe also reach like a larger audience? Is this something I can teach classes about? And, you know, at that time, I was not really aware of the fact that, you know, there had been for about, you know, at least a decade, going back into the 90s, you know, a real kind of horror scholarship, you know. So that was exciting, you know, that was exciting to learn. But I also, you know, I really got into it when I began to feel that, you know, so much of what I was reading was heavily theoretical kind of. And, you know, just wanted to talk to people like you guys who, you know, from a lot of different backgrounds that loved monsters as much as I do, and try to figure out their meaning. So that's that's how I ended up on the show, Jeff.
It's funny. I grew up, I was never one of those kids that was taught to believe in Santa Claus or anything like that. And so for me, some part of me always wanted there to be magic in the world, I guess. And then I also was born with hydrocephalus. And so I, you know, when I was a little bit older, I was depressed. I felt like an outsider. I felt strange and had all these weird scars from surgeries and stuff. And I really could relate to outsiders and entities that have suffered. And that's really all that I could relate to. And so I grew up watching sightings on the Sci-Fi Channel religiously and cryptid stuff, and a little bit later the X-Files was my absolute jam. And then when I was in undergrad, I was getting a philosophy degree, and one of my mentors co-edited some pop culture philosophy books, and I submitted to one of them and got in for Terminator and Philosophy was my first one. And then from there, I just, you know, started writing all these side chapters, even through grad school. On the side, I'd write stuff, you know, doing deep dives into Jurassic Park or Frankenstein or all these different topics. And at a certain point, I realized, like, I like that way more than the stuff that I'm doing in grad school. And then eventually I just, you know, long story short, I quit grad school and decided, well, I just want to write about movies and then eventually make them. And that's all I really want to do.
That makes a lot of sense. That's awesome.
It does. Well, so it sounds like we're all essentially monster kids then. So
we are.
Absolutely.
So and this is what I love about monsters, because they're so personal. I feel like even if you don't have the same monster interest as someone else, like if you have monsters in common, there's already kind of a shared understanding. And I think a lot of that has to do with, like, you know, what we were talking about like feeling like outsiders or actually being outsiders and looking like outsiders and being, you know, having like a marked visible difference between us and other people. And so, but how many different shapes that takes, you know? I mean, there's like, gosh, every person that I know who likes monsters likes them for a different reason or has a different story that goes with it. And to me, I can't really think of something else from stories that has as much of a draw as monsters do. I mean, like even like the horror comedy people, like they're into monsters, but they're into their own kinds of monsters. And it's like, and then they have their reasons for why they need the monsters to be funny. And like, man, it's just every conversation that I have with someone who's in particular into monsters, it ends up becoming so much more than just about the stories. Our lives immediately come into it. And you saw just how we were talking just now, like all three of us, it's so personal. And I just think it's incredible. Just that's one of the things about monsters for me that just makes them so marvelous and why I've just been obsessed with them since I was a kid.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I think, you know, you're absolutely right that they're both so incredibly personal, and yet, you know, they do give us this like kind of universal language, you know, to talk in. I mean, when you were talking about, you know, Medusa, I saw several iterations of that scene, you know, going back to, you know, Ray Harryhausen and forward and knowing, you know, sort of precisely what you meant about the beauty of something that's that is hybrid. That combines different things in ways that, like, especially when you're a kid, but also if you're an adult, you know, with magic in your eyes, you can still see and experience that. And there's also something really cool about just I love the idea of sort of the beauty of monsters. And I'm always fascinated, and this maybe gets into some things we'll talk about later on. I'm always fascinated when I talk with someone who's not able to see that. And it's and I you know, and I you know, you obviously you try not to prejudge like sort of what that means, but I've been really interested over the years as I've had, like, you know, different conversations with people, the way in which, you know, somebody who kind of rejects horror and monsters out of hand, it's not always the case, but then I also find that, like, there's other things I really don't want to talk to them about, you know, including politics and the natures of people's identity and other sort of stuff. So yeah, I love that notion that you brought up about the beauty that we see.
Yeah. And I feel like for people that really get it too, like, and I'm sure this is the case for more people than just me, I think if you feel a bit displaced, there's a power in identifying with monsters.
Oh yeah.
Like, I joke around the house with I shouldn't even say this on air because it's kind of dorky, but I will say it because it's our show right now. I joke about how, like, I'm a Babadook, and then 3 days a month I'm a Babadook werewolf. I'm also a werewolf. So
cute.
Just because it's just like a dorky joke, but I don't know, there's some power in identifying with creatures that can do things that are magnificent.
Yes.
And that can call upon things that we might find to be frightening or deformities or weaknesses, and to use them as strengths and sources of power.
Right. Oh, exactly. And actually, Scott, I think we might be closer in age than you think, because the Harryhausen movies that was how I met Medusa.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I was obsessed with his films.
That beautiful image.
Oh, I love him.
Yeah, it is gorgeous.
Gorgeous.
We were talking, I actually could just sort of picture, and I don't know if you had the same experience when you first saw it, just sort of feeling the fluid movement of the snakes, and also this gorgeous woman who at the same time is not exactly a woman. Is just crossing all of these different categories, and it's just like, I'm in love.
Absolutely gorgeous. And then once I started reading about her, and then you learn what her backstory was, and that she was turned into a monster to protect her from men. Yeah. And that's why she turns men to stone, because she was assaulted. And I mean, oh my gosh, her story is so tragic. And so that even made her more beautiful to me once I learned about all of that. Mm-hmm. And so she's kind of become she's definitely become kind of a deity for me.
She's kind of like the archetype. She's kind of the archetype for all revenge horror, if you think about it.
She is.
And it's awesome.
Yeah, she's like the first vagina dentata.
This is I Spit on Your Grave, 500 BCE. Yeah,
absolutely. Oh my gosh, she's. I actually at one point, so I have a really big head tattoo, and at one point I actually did consider getting snakes tattooed on my head. Yeah, I really did, but I felt that it might be a little bit too aggressive for what my kind of general look is, even though I am quite aggressive. But I don't know, something about it didn't feel right. But I still might put one up there. But yeah, that was totally one of my ideas, to like cover my head with snakes. But yeah, I have all kinds of weird horror ideas for that.
I endorse it. That's just me, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you after this conversation, you might just decide, I'm going to do it. So
maybe
you have mine and Jeff's endorsement.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
We'll back you up.
Perfect.
So kind of moving on, just for the audience's sake. So how would you both define what a monster is?
Ooh, let Scott go first for this one.
Oh.
Well, you wrote your whole book is. Your whole book is about this, and it's. I love how you've done it.
You may be humble, but you are straight up an expert. So,
dude, yeah.
Okay, well, let's give it a shot, and feel free to, as they needed to do at the debate the other night, to cut my mic.
Mr. President.
No, not you.
If I go too long. So one of the things about the book Monsters in America is, I knew obviously that there was going to be this expectation that, as with a lot of books like this, Chapter 1 is going to contain my definition of a monster so that we know what it is that I'm up to kind of through, the next 250 pages or whatever it is. And I consciously chose not to give a sort of set of markers for what a monster is or how I define a monster. I steered away from, Jeffrey Cohen's approach of here's the monster theses. This is like this is a straightforward definition. And instead, and this is the kind of the historian side of me, I wanted to say, okay, what a monster has been different in every single era. And so I'm sort of going for the particular rather than the universal. Right. What were many people afraid of in the 19th century as opposed to the 20th, as opposed to the 21st? And then how did that interact with ideas about race, ideas about gender, ideas about sexuality, ideas about social class? And so, kind of what I came up with, and I didn't put it quite this way in the book, is that, it's kind of become this, I think, a little bit sort of overused trope of, the monsters are really us, and and that kind of idea. Instead, my notion is a little bit more like every century and every particular moment in American history, I think in global history too, kind of gets the monsters that it asks for. and gets the monsters that it deserves in some ways. Actually, going back to my earlier comment about, conversations with people about whether they like monsters or not. Many people who are sort of resistant to the idea of horror, as you get to know them a little bit better, you find out that they're also afraid of a lot of things, afraid of different kinds of people, politics that don't match theirs, parts of the world that they have trouble navigating in different ways. So I guess my focus is less on the monster and, in terms of defining it than what it tells us when a society is fearful about a particular thing, at least, and when they see monsters not as beautiful as we've been talking about, but as predatory and as dangerous.
Oh man, I could listen to you talk about this all day for real.
Unfortunately, I could talk about it all day.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to kind of pick up on something that you said, how you mentioned that every sort of generation has their own monster, so to speak. It's so interesting if you look at different eras of, for example, monster films and the sort of issues they were preoccupied with. Like, I mean, obviously you have like the nuclear monsters of the 50s and the kaiju films that came out of that. But like before that, the Universal monsters, it's really interesting to look at that era because most of the motivation for many of them, not all, but many of them, were they just wanted love. They wanted to participate in what we would consider at that time your standard human relationship, like Frankenstein was lonely and wanted a mate. The Mummy wanted a mate. Arguably Creature from the Black Lagoon may have, but it didn't speak, so it's hard to attribute motive, but probably.
That's true. No, it's fascinating because monsters are, like we were talking about them earlier about being so personal, but monsters are also so political. Yeah. And I think for me, it's that, and I know it sounds very second wave feminism and that's really over, but the one thing that I love from second wave feminism is the idea that the personal and the political, well, they intersect, right? And the personal is political and the political is also personal. And so when you look at different monsters, you see this dynamic all the time. And I mean, I feel like you could almost do like a tarot reading depending on like what kind of monsters people like, because you could tell so much about their background. Yep. And like what Scott was saying about, what are they scared of? What kind, because every horror person has some horror movies that they won't watch. Yeah. There's every single person has that. And that also, it tells you so much. But at the same time, even when looking at the movies that we don't want to watch, like, for example, I'm really not into the ones with like a lot of torture and gore and all of that. But, you look at how zombies have evolved over the years. I mean, it follows the political trajectory almost exactly. And, from the slow moving ones to the fast moving ones. And like now we've got the whole debate about that. And all of that is political, So to me, that's just one of the most incredible things about horror. But I also feel like when it comes to monsters, for me, a big thing about what defines a monster is that it's an other, and an other with a capital O.
Right.
And so when I think about it in terms of that, monsters can be humans, monsters can be creatures, they can be aliens, they could be any number of things. But for me, the defining factor is the fact that they're somehow separate. Or they're perceived as separate, even if they aren't actually separate, they're perceived as such. And then how does the dynamic build from there?
Yeah, I don't. I was trying to think when you were talking about, what monsters will I not watch, and what sort of subgenres will I not watch, and it's really difficult to think. To think of any. I used to get in trouble for having Fangoria magazines in my room. So the gore stuff has never bothered me. There has been, and this is a rather large. I guess these are the movies I would not watch. Essentially, anything produced by Cinestate. Charleston Concrete. These purposefully reactionary films that are essentially kind of Trump era propaganda, which goes back to your important point that As with everything in mass culture, and really as with everything, monsters are inherently political.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved your tarot card example, because I think that we can tell a lot about, sort of not just the monsters that someone would pick, but the ones, that they might reject.
Yeah, exactly. Because like for me, the demon possession stories, oh boy, those are the ones that I really, I have a hard time with those. And I saw The Exorcist when I was way too young. And actually, I might have even been Regan's age when I saw it. Yeah. And I'm very sensitive. So even at a young age, I was already kind of like picking up on a lot of things that were going on around me that other people didn't think that I would notice, but I noticed everything. And so the idea that something could get inside me like that, I felt it made me feel very vulnerable. Like it felt like it could happen to me. And even now I'm almost 42, and I watch those movies and I really I have my candles around me. I have little mantras that I say, and a lot of times now I just will turn it off because I just get so scared. Yeah. And those are the one thing that scare me. Like I can watch torture stuff. I don't like it, but I can get through it fine. Right. But it's the demon. Oh man, the demon possession stuff. Ooh.
I can do the demon stuff sometimes. But the genre that I won't even say that it scares me, but I just don't get as much out of is standard slashers. Don't do anything for me.
Oh, they're my favorite. I love them.
I love some. I love Halloween, and I love You're Next, and some of the home invasion ones are really good. But I tried doing a watch of the Friday the 13th ones, and I'm just I don't know why it didn't do anything for me.
It isn't so. Oh my gosh, Jason's my man.
Yeah, well, and also I think that one thing if you were with the Friday the 13th films, I think that if you didn't sneak into the theater and see them or watch them on VHS, the special effects, especially in high def, are just not as convincing as they used to be.
I think that's fair.
We were absolutely, my friends and I were absolutely convinced that an actor we had never heard of before, named Kevin Bacon, had been killed in Friday the 13th Part 1. Mm-hmm. Because how else did Tom Savini do that? You know? Although that was going back actually to a point that you made, Jeff, about kind of, thinking about sort of the magic in the world. One of the great things about Fangoria was back in the 80s is that you would watch these films and be like, oh my God, I just saw somebody killed. And then, but then you would actually learn about, hey, there was this guy named Tom Savini, and this is how he did it, and it's stuff that was sitting around your house that this, absolute 100% genius was able to turn into just a really convincing scare. And it turned out Kevin Bacon was fine, actually.
Yeah. And then, going back to what we were talking about earlier about politics, I mean, Savini, he learned what dead bodies looked like because he was a war photographer in the Vietnam War. And so the stuff that he saw, he brought all of that trauma from the war back with him, and then he put it on screen in a way that no one had ever seen it before. And I think in that context, he did such a service to people. I mean, I remember one of the things, I saw some documentary, I think it was about the Romero films, and he mentioned about how it was bothering him so much when people, it was bothering Savini so much when people would die on screen and their eyes would close. And he was like, that's not how people die. And so what, so a detail like that, you hear it and it's you might not even notice it when you're watching one of Savini's films, but those details are there. And I feel like that's one of the things that brings me constantly back to the Friday the 13th movies. Because it's not necessarily what's on screen, but it's how it got there. Yeah. And each movie's so different. That's really, that and Scream are my two favorite slasher franchises. And, but Friday the 13th is, that was my first favorite. So that's always going to have, Jason always has a special place in my heart.
Yeah, for me, I think it's and I actually do love Jason and his mom, but
Yeah.
but yeah, for me it was the original Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right.
Oh, I love it.
Lost interest after that a little bit, but definitely Halloween.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of that was
Yeah.
kind of a fascination with. I mean, I think actually Halloween. Thinking back, as a teenager, when I wasn't old enough to see it in the theater, so I was, like a lot in our generation, saw it on VHS, and I was. It's kind of like it's such an inventive film. And obviously John Carpenter's, an incredible filmmaker. I think maybe my first experience, and I stress kind of because, you're talking about a 16-year-old, but kind of reading a film, sort of getting a sense that, that was I didn't put it this way, but that tracking shot scared me because combined with Jamie Lee Curtis, which is I think a really important part of the slasher tradition is just that and I have kind of a different view on this than many commentators about it, but I just really think that I don't agree with Carol Clover, for example, that the final girl is a kind of a stand-in for a male experience. I think the final girl is really kind of some of the first in American culture female action heroes, and that's something that we've gotten kind of used to. But when you're a certain age, you remember a time when Jamie Lee Curtis fighting back in that closet with a bent hanger and. Heather Langenkamp getting a special forces manual and, doing this weird Home Alone thing. Home Alone thing with Fred. That was strange. You didn't.
No, that's actually one thing that I really love about, I love Halloween, big Carpenter fan in general. And it's funny too, because it kind of, those movies or You're Next, I always loved as a later film. But I just love how the protagonist, you see her initially as some grad student who's kind of overshadowed. And then when stuff goes down, though, she goes into full guerrilla warfare mode and has this wealth of skills and is a complete badass in a lot of the ways that Heather is or Laurie Strode. And it really does literally turn the tables, that they can go from characters that at face value we would see as mousy, and then when you actually get to know them, they can hold their own against masses of killers or supernatural beasts,
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think the chick in Your Next, wasn't she a survivalist or something? I think, didn't she mention at some point that and I think that's so cool too, because what we were talking about with politics earlier, we have a segment of people out there right now who are in bunkers training their families for whatever thing they think is coming. And to see her come out of that bunker and then end up in this fancy house and then get set upon, and then watching those skills actually come to use is I don't know, that kind of made me feel a lot of different complicated things, because it's I felt she was traumatized, she already came from this traumatized background, and then to be re-traumatized in that way, oh man, that movie. Yeah, I had a little panic attack watching that. I remember having to pause it for a second because I got very much connected with her. And this is another thing that happens with me, is that sometimes when I connect with a character on screen, I actually start feeling their pain in my body. Which is why I'm really not a huge fan of torture stuff, because especially if I like the person who's in the movie, watching bad things happen to them, I will physically have pain.
Hey, human empathy is amazing.
Sometimes it's really creepy. Sometimes I'll have bruises. Watching John Wick movies. Oh my gosh. That's a totally separate story, but me and Keanu have a whole thing too. But I mean, really, like I'll have bruises afterwards because I'm so tense from whatever's happening. So, but yeah, the chicken you're next, like for me, there's so much going on in that film, and it all the way from like the politics of her upbringing and the trauma of that, the child abuse of that. And then of course, like meeting this wealthy family and thinking, oh my gosh, I've made it, right? I'm like out of my survivalist thing.
Things is good. Things will be good.
Yeah, I'm out. Like, the light is here, and then to have to go all the way back again and like regress in a way. Oh, it was that's kind of a heartbreaking movie.
It is, and it's kind of become a little bit of a subgenre of films like this. Although some of the more interesting ones, I think, also don't. I recently saw Samara Weaving in Ready or Not.
Yep.
That, but
that's another one. Yeah,
the film that's I saw it on Shudder, Revenge. So what's interesting to me about these is that, and I think there's a lot going on here politically, but the women are not from sort of survivalist backgrounds,
right?
There's not an explanation given to it or why they're suddenly able to survive. And I think it's very interesting that they are, to use a term my students use all the time, they're sort of these basic white women who are put in these situations and are fighting. In the case of Revenge, quite literally fighting misogyny, sexual assault. Samara Weaving's fighting for her life. And also the background of getting caught up in this kind of wealthy family that is, as much a death cult as like most wealthy families. It's kind of
oh my God!
So I don't know everything about what's going on with that. I've been thinking about it as these movies have been coming out, but so many of them are post 2016, and I think something is happening there in terms of. I hope something's happening there with white women, white people who maybe have felt in the past that their privilege has protected them, that the water will not come up to their door in some ways, and I don't know if that's what's happening, but it is a very interesting subgenre that has emerged in horror.
No, it is, and actually, I have kind of a strange theory about Revenge. Actually, like kind of. Yeah. So, okay. So do you guys remember when she eats the apple and she leaves it on the counter and then ants start crawling all over it? Okay. So where they are is Hopi land. And those guys are, murder tourists. They're there to kill animals. They're out to hunt, and it's native land. It's sovereign native land that's been stolen by the American government. So what happens is, I think, she leaves the apple there, and the spirits of the land, in the form of the ants, accepts her offering. And when she dies, they bring her back to get revenge on them. So it's not just her revenge; it's the revenge of the land as well. So that's my theory.
Go back and watch it. I'm sorry to say I completely missed all of that. So
I'm weird. I'm really weird.
Well, no, and honestly though, it makes sense just in the very broad horror tradition because as Colin Dickey and Ghostland and some of his other work has written really well about the idea of the house is haunted because it was built on an quote unquote Indian burial ground.
Right.
That always works because everything is built on an Indian burial ground in the United States.
It is, yeah, absolutely. So
that makes sense to me. I'm just going to. I just completely missed it. So I'm gonna go.
It's so good. I mean, because the ants, for Hopi, they represent the people who, so there's 4 worlds, right? So in Hopi religion, there have been 4 worlds, and at the end of each one, the humans go underground, and the ants are the ones who help keep them alive. And that's why ants have small waists, because they've given up parts of their food in order to keep people alive. And then when it's safe, the ants will let people know that they can come back up to the surface again. And so that's why I figured, like, with the ants covering the apple and leaving, in native culture, I would say in almost all of them, there's traditions of leaving food out as an offering to the spirits of the land, to your ancestors, to, just as to say thank you for letting me be here on your space. And so her leaving that apple there, to me, was an offering that the land accepted. And then when the bad things happened to her, the land, they helped her back. So
it's also kind of interesting too, because that's kind of a rebirth myth in a significant way. And it's also interesting that she kind of like upgrades, if you will, when she seals her wound with that phoenix beer can in the cave and it leaves that like phoenix scar on her. And at that point on, she's like a Terminator.
Yeah.
Right.
I think she's a zombie. Honestly, I don't even think she's human anymore. I think that she's gone into another state.
Because it does look like, if I remember right, just from memory, because she has like this, she passes out in the cave, passes out, quote unquote, and then has this weird, almost supernatural vision, and then wakes up this like murder machine.
Pretty much, yeah.
And I would pick the Phoenix symbology, bringing the monsters back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, as I'm thinking about it too, so part of the emergence of the cave moment also was, we were introduced to her as, sort of supermodel arm candy for, this rich bro,
douchebag.
But then I don't want to say that, but yes.
I have a stronger word, but I won't say it.
An individual of low value or worth.
So when she becomes the Terminator version of herself, she's sort of drenched in mud and every kind of heteronormative conception of beauty is gone. And that is kind of underscored by, the just incredibly explosive violence that she's capable of, which
they deserve.
And they did.
Which men are incredibly.
They deserved. Oh my God. I love that movie.
I love that part of those films, and that film in particular. Where I'm like, you're getting what you deserve, and I am here for it.
And actually, that's another thing I liked about because it's a woman who made that film, and it's really fascinating when women do rape revenge as compared to men. Yeah. The female gaze is so different. I mean, her assault, it happens kind of off screen.
Yeah, we don't see it.
You know it's happening. You can hear her. But it's the way that it's done. It doesn't lose any of the horrible, grotesque power of that act.
And there isn't any sexualization of that moment. Yeah, like it's not voyeuristic.
Exactly. Like nobody needs to see that anymore. I'm sorry if you don't know what this is. Then I don't know what to tell you. But it does not need to be on screen anymore. There's plenty of examples of it. We know what it looks like. A lot of people have been through it themselves. We don't need to see it, just full stop. That's it. And so I feel like a lot of times when women take on rape revenge, it's so much more satisfying for me because you don't have to witness that horrible thing that what it looks like, what it sounds like. It's just unimaginable horror. And why do we need to put an actress through that? Why does the director why do people need to see that? We just don't need to see it. So I really love revenge for that aspect too, it can still that the act can have that horrible power that it has, but we don't have to witness it. And I think there's so many ugly things we're witnessing all the time, and even in horror movies too. But the act of rape itself, I think, is just something different. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
This actually reminds me of we were talking about the early slashers and the Final Girl, and with all the focus on Carol Clover's work over the years, which is pretty extraordinary. There's this great book that I don't hear about a lot, and that kind of got passed over. It was by a scholar named Christina Pinedo.
Okay.
And it's called Recreational Terror.
I have that.
In their response to horror films. And she has the most interesting reading of what women in the 1980s were bringing to slasher films. And one of the things that she says, and it's much more nuanced than this, is that some of the fear was not about what Michael Myers was going to do or what Freddy Krueger was going to do. Some of the fear was that they were watching a film maybe for the first time in their lives, thinking about, teenage women in the 1980s, in which a woman was being allowed to engage in extreme violence against, a male figure.
Right.
And, now that, because we have films like Revenge, because we have films like, the Samara Weaving thing and other stuff, I don't know if we quite grasp the power of women being able to do violence to their predator.
Yeah.
And how sort of scary that would be if, your baby boomer parents from the, that carried, very traditional ideas from the 50s and notions about how, women ought to behave and how they ought not to behave.
Right.
And watching these movies, at a time when, for Christ's sake, I mean, in the 1980s, marital rape had not even been made illegal.
Yep.
Yet. I mean, that's in the 1990s that there's precedence even for that. So, I mean, it just kind of shows you, I think the power of horror to unleash some of these things that you would never imagine a mainstream film, taking on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
One thing I do want to get to, I'd love to hear both of your takes on people that don't necessarily have like a deep bench of background in watching, creature features, monster films, analyzing these things repeatedly, might find it unfamiliar to think of how monsters have meaning and how they have symbolism. And I'd love to talk about your takes on why, like how they have meaning and why it's important to understand those meanings.
I think that they should read our books.
Fully endorse that.
That's actually that would be a good start, honestly, because I mean, mine it's a series of vignettes that the first part is written as a horror comic, and then the second part is a horror movie, and then the third part is as a series of essays that all go into kind of feminist theory, female gaze, and monsters. And then Scott's is, the historic roots of monsters in America and going all the way back. So I think between both of our books, you get a really, really, really deep look at monsters and monster significance, from two completely different perspectives that really go well together, though, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons that that I've admired your work for a while, and I actually also along the same lines would recommend a extraordinary graphic novel by Emil Ferris. My favorite thing is Monsters.
Oh yeah,
which both introduces sort of, here's why someone who feels outcasts for various reasons might be attracted to them and find the monster a friend. But then it also intersects the story of monsters and ideas of monsters from, everything from, good grief, the history of Weimar Germany to Chicago in the late 60s to racism and particularly anti-Latinx racism in America. It's just, an extraordinary graphic novel that
Oh,
I
cool.
think anybody that I think that's one of the books I would say, hey, somebody said, how do I figure out like why this matters? You know, kind of. And I actually have used it in classes, and students love it, find it immediately accessible, and then also I think just kind of come away understanding, you know, if they didn't grow up watching horror films, or, you know, there's always that shocking 3 or 4 students that show up in my classes that are on the first day are like, you know, I actually just really don't like horror at all. I always wonder, wow, you're in absolutely the wrong place. But
how do you respond to that? I don't even know what I would say. Like, why are you here? Why are you talking to me?
You know, that's tough.
I don't know.
I often do. So one of the things that I do, you know, to kind of get people talking on the first day is you know, just tell us who you are, and tell us who what your favorite horror movie, TV show, whatever, you know, is.
Right.
And so it always comes around to somebody that will say, I don't really have one, because honestly, I don't really like horror. And the interesting thing is, I often don't have to say anything, because their follow-up is something along the lines of, that's kind of why I'm here. Like, I'm trying to figure this out. This is something that, like, you know, our culture is seems to be obsessed with. All my friends are obsessed with. And so that's interesting. And it also gets into some of the debates, which I'm sure we don't have time for, where, you know, they'll often say, I've had, this is just one example, but it's just come up maybe 6 times in classrooms. A student will say, you know, I really love Silence of the Lambs, and kind of like the Silence of the Lambs verse, sort of.
Yeah.
But I don't know, is that horror? Like, do you consider, you know, kind of that whole thing? And so, you know, and I always love that, actually. Because it's like, wow, we got a lot to talk about this semester. There's all kinds of things, because, you know, I think one of the reasons that that Korea is kind of eating our lunch in terms of producing great horror films is that there's not these kind of strict lines between genres.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, and so that, like, the question of, you know, is Parasite a horror film?
Like, at times, in scenes, it's horror.
Yeah, you know, and so I think that's is obviously a whole other discussion, but I think it's interesting in the way that, and of course, genre is related to marketing, right? And so in the United States, that's sort of what it's all about.
Yeah,
so.
the Silence of the Lambs discussion is really interesting to me too, because not to go too far afield, but my usual first comment is that the distinction between, like, a psychological thriller and a horror film is pretty much meaningless and very subjective.
I think so too. Yeah.
You know, because there are some where I'm like, okay, a lot of David Fincher thrillers. Like, is Seven a horror film? Maybe that one is. Yeah, maybe that one is. But, like,
yes. It is. Watch it again. Watch it again in HD, and you will not argue with me about this.
Yeah, like, I would say that one is. You know.
I think that's an interesting discussion, but I think also one thing that we in our kind of genre fascinations, we've also just a little bit lost sight, you know, as a culture of that genre is really a relatively new, you know, idea in so many ways, and so you know, borrowing, sort of thinking about older notions about, you know, sort of what counts as the stories that disturb us.
Right.
That's obviously a very, very broad category.
It's kind of funny because just to think about that, because to define genre cinema, it's often treated as though, well, okay, here are films and dramas and comedies, and then here's all this weird stuff off to the side that, you know, you can like, it's kind of minor, whatever. The first recorded human writings, were we to apply a genre to them now, were genre writings. Epic poems had monsters and horror moments and romance and not tons of comedy, but they definitely had action. Gilgamesh is arguable superhero horror fantasy.
No, definitely. You can definitely see that. And I mean, any culture you go to in the world, there are monsters. And I mean, it's almost like monsters are where it's all started. And so I think, you know, if as humans, I think we're always looking for meaning, right? Well, maybe not all of us anymore. I feel like that used to be a thing, but these days I'm not so sure. But, you know, for those of us who are searching for meaning,
for those of us who think meaning matters anymore.
No, oh gosh, what has this world done to me? Yeah, it's weird. And again, talking about like how politics affects our perception of monsters. I mean, my gosh, I don't even know what's true anymore half the time when I look at the news. But you know, but that, you know, that aside, as we look for meaning, you know, in our lives and where we fit in society and all of that, I think most people at some point or another have felt like they didn't quite know exactly what was going on and that they weren't really part of what they thought they were part of, even if they might not like necessarily look like they are. And I think, I don't know, I think for monsters, like the draw is that they can be completely different and they can also look just like us. And the fact that there's just so few things that are both at once. It's like you know, it's like quantum physics of identity or something, that it's two simultaneous things that are contradictory, but they're happening at the same time in the same moment. And that's I think what's so cool about monsters is that there's this inherent tension in them, and that's the tension, like trying to figure out what is that tension and why is it making me feel a certain way and this other person a completely different way, and then trying to figure out what it is that it's what it's doing. Like, I think monsters are very active, and so your like engagement with monsters it's I don't think it's a passive thing for any of us who love them. It's we're constantly looking to see like, what is it about this particular monster that I'm really frightened by, or this one, like everyone else is scared by this monster, but I don't find them scary. I find them sad, like, you know. And so then we're parsing the meaning as we try to understand a figure that like is so many things all at once. And yeah, and that's I mean, that's what I love about them. I think that's what all three of us love about monsters is. I mean, we could literally probably sit here the whole rest of the day and not even miss a beat. Like, we'll get hungry at some point, but. You know, that'll be what ends the conversation. It's like, dude, I'm about to faint with hunger. Like, I got to go now.
Go ahead.
We should all do a Zoom happy hour at some point.
Sounds awesome.
Oh my God, I would love that.
That would be my favorite thing.
Use all the words we want to use.
Yes.
It's so interesting too, because because they're multifaceted and there's so many aspects. Like when I, was doing pop culture philosophy chapters, for each individual monster, there's different aspects. There's so many that you could look at, but to gather the meaning that, there's a lot of right answers really, but to gather the meaning that speaks to you. For some monsters, it's, the beast's, the creature's nature, or its behavior, or the attributes of its physical body, but for some it's a social context and its origins. There's so many different aspects to look at to gather that multi-layered meaning.
Absolutely, yeah.
The thing about, one of the things about the Xenomorph is that it penetrates your face and impregnates you with a thing that kills you by bursting out of your chest.
Yeah. Oh, I love that queen. Oh, she's so beautiful. She's another one of my...
The Xenomorph Queen.
Oh, she's another one of my favorites. I love her.
She's a good mom, too.
She's a great mom. She takes care of her kids.
Yep. It's funny. One really warm memory I have is before my mom passed away years ago. She knew that I loved horror movies, and they weren't really her thing, but she loved spending time with me. So when I would come over and she'd have TiVo'd horror films and then she'd stay up late and watch them with me, even though they weren't her thing. And one of the ones, it was very sweet. And one of the ones we watched that I remember was Aliens. And it was so nice to watch maybe the best horror film about motherhood other than the Babadook.
Oh.
With my mom.
And Psycho.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Had she seen it before?
I don't think she had. I mean, it came out when I was born, so she could have, but I don't think she saw it before.
Okay.
Wow. Like,
well, that's a great memory.
Yeah.
You can connect with people over these meanings.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so sweet that she decided that even though she didn't like it, that she was just going to like give it a go because you liked it.
Yeah, I never asked her to do that. She was just lovely.
Oh.
Yeah, so there's that.
See, horror is community, horror is family, horror is bonding, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, that's monsters. That's what our monsters do for us. I mean, gee, look how we met. Like, we all three met from monsters. I mean, that's exactly what brought us all together. I know other people do this with like sports and stuff, but like if you listen to people talking about sports, it doesn't sound like this.
Right.
I mean,
that's absolutely true.
It really doesn't. You know, they talk about other things that are very specific about plays and this and that, but there's really no bigger talk about like, well, why is it a ball? And why is it a goal? Like, where did this come from? Why is it played like this? Like, they don't ask those questions about it because they don't really have to, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know.
I totally agree. You know, I almost feel like it sometimes that it's more like people coming together over a shared religion,
right?
Than even say, you know, if friends that you make because of a commonality of politics, you know, for example, or love of sports or love of, you know, whatever it happens to be. And except that, you know, I think that like in some ways monsters are even a more important community building language, because so many of these questions that we're talking about in relation to like movies that we love, they're really kind of abstract and conceptual questions that go really, really deep into, you know, the heart of things. And so sort of unlike at least some expressions of religion, there's not sort of just answers, you know, that we all agree on. And that's the reason why we can sit around and bond over the monsters that we love.
Totally. And for future episodes, you know, the format will be digging deep into specific monsters and films, but my stance on it is that there's not going to be one right way of interpreting these things. Like maybe for one particular film, someone's more interested in the themes pertaining to gender, but I'm more interested in themes pertaining to the environment. Those are both useful perspectives if that actually does relate to the work. You know, it's so complicated. There are multiple right answers.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, and like what we were talking about earlier with monsters being, you know, multifaceted creatures, it's so often we have to choose one thing to talk about. Like if I'm writing an essay about a movie, I can't necessarily write about every single thing that I see in the monster. I've got to focus. I mean, as much as I would want to, you know, that's just like not how it works. So being able to explore, I mean, that's what I love about the idea for your podcast, is that being able to explore like one character and really doing a deep dive into all of the different things that it represents to different people. I mean, no one's really done anything like that yet. And I think it's just so it's going to be such a valuable resource. And, you know, the other thing I wanted to say really quick was, you know, when we were talking about how monsters are kind of community building and all that, I think one of the things about it that's so fascinating and that sets the monster community apart from others is, well, we get together because we all will talk about what we're afraid of, right? And there's like a really amazing kind of vulnerability that comes with being part of the horror community, because we all admit that we're scared and that there are things that scare us, and we are very open about what those things are. And I mean, you know, for me, one of my favorite aspects of monsters is kind of how monsters are born of trauma. And so, you know, when you're talking about how monsters get born of trauma, well, you end up talking about your own trauma. It ends up, you know, getting other people comfortable to talk about their traumas and other things that they've related to, because specifically because of their trauma and how their trauma changed them or what they saw reflected. And I think that makes it a really kind of there's a kind of intimacy in the horror community that I don't really see in other communities, just for this fact that like we're all like, hey, we're all a bunch of people, we're all scared of something. So like, what are you scared of? And then we just start. Like for some people, it takes them years to even admit they're scared of something. You know what I mean? Like in relationships, people don't want to admit that they're afraid or that something frightens them or that they saw something that really like made them have bad dreams. Like people don't want to admit that because then it means that like we're not all powerful. And I think that's what's so cool about horror fans and the monster kids is that we're really open about all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, we're going to talk about fear today. Cool. Like, let's get in it.
Like, what are you afraid of? Great. Awesome. That is scary.
Yeah.
Me too.
Exactly.
Yeah. So much of what we are, just as a community and then as individuals, watching, reading and thinking about, I mean, it's, it's ultimately an iconography of death.
Yes.
I should have used that podcast title.
So that does, take us to a place where, we're talking about our deepest traumas, both with our experience of the death of our loved ones, as you shared, Jeff, and also the recognition of our own mortality.
Yeah.
And, this is not a thing people... this does not make you popular at parties to bring this kind of thing up. Take it from me. Second
that I'm that person too. Sorry.
Yeah, someone's just like living life, being like, woo! And you're like, excuse me, I think you need to get off the roof because we're all mortal. You're mortal. And we will be forever traumatized if you smash yourself on the pool. And they're like, go home, Jeff.
Right. Oh my God.
And also that scene was in, we know that scene was in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4 and how that turned out. So, yeah.
We know how that went, man. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Never.
So I think that, it's a willingness to discuss trauma. It's willingness to, face, sort of the king of fears and that sort of thing. So, I definitely think that that's true. I think it's part of the reason, although, as I alluded to earlier by mentioning a specific production company, it is true that we have problems, but in terms of toxic fandoms, of which there are a lot, I really, it's interesting to me that the horror community is a group of people that almost without fail, one finds them to be compassionate, kind, thoughtful, often politically progressive people. And I think that, and it's interesting because for so long, thinking back to, the 1980s, for example, when something, a teacher was likely to think something was wrong with you if, you got caught with your Famous Monsters or Fangoria magazine.
Yeah.
And yet, honestly, like the most well-adjusted people I know are huge horror fans.
Yeah.
And then when you find someone a friend or a partner that accepts that part of you, it feels like a deeper acceptance than others, like maybe superficial things might be. Like one of the first gifts that my fiance ever got me was this giant poster of John Carpenter's The Thing. And she also got me, so like the Babadook got really popular with like the shipping the Babadook is gay and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, before that, you couldn't find any merchandise. And the Babadook is one of my favorite recent horror films. She got me on Etsy from Russia a handmade Babadook before there was merchandise.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute.
And I'm like, you freaking get me, you awesome person.
Oh, that's great. No, actually, for 1 year for Valentine's Day, my husband got me the full Friday the 13th box set. And I opened it, and of course, like, I'm absolutely thrilled. And he's like, and it's red for Valentine's Day. Oh man, yeah. prized possession right there.
Yeah, exactly. When someone accepts that part of you, you just feel seen.
Right.
Do you have any favorite monsters, ones that particularly mean something to you, or that is just your damn favorite because it's amazing?
Oh, I have. Oh, well, I already talked about Medusa a lot, so like
Mhm.
she's my foundational one. Oh my gosh, just love monsters. This is a really hard one.
It's okay. There are only right answers. So,
Well, the Xenomorph from Alien, I love her so much. Oh my gosh, the Queen she's my queen.
the design is like fucking
So
flawless.
gosh, she's so beautiful, and how she changes over the course of the franchise. Oh my god, I love that monster. Also, I love Hannibal Lecter. I love him. It's so creepy. I don't know why, and I just keep going back to it because I'm just trying to figure out what my fascination is with this guy, but. He doesn't like rude people, and
I do like.
I think that might be it. And I love the revenge. Oh, you're rude to me. I'm going to eat you.
I love that he is a cannibal, but if someone throws like excrement or is vulgar, he's like, Clarice, I'm so sorry. I will destroy that guy for you. I'm like, oh, yes. What a chivalrous cannibal.
He's definitely the most cultured cannibal of in horror cinema.
I don't know. I'm fascinated with him.
I was always fascinated with him too. I get that because there's sort of the interesting combination of the viciousness and the sophistication.
Yeah.
And like so many of the best monsters, you don't want him to get caught. You are sort of rooting for him, which is kind of an interesting exploration of oneself.
I know. Dexter is another one of my favorites.
I love that show.
Oh, Dexter. I don't know. I think for me, maybe like monsters have something to do with justice. And I love that Dexter, he's got his code and he's a serial killer. I know it's terrible. But he's going and killing bad people, and they're the ones that are slipping through the justice system. And our justice system works too slowly anyway. So,
and he does his research,
and he does for most of it.
yeah, it's a little spotty sometimes.
He goes off the rails toward the end, but he is so traumatized by the end of the show. But I think maybe that's all between him and Hannibal. I think it's like the kind of justice aspect is something that really appeals to me with them, which is odd because like most of the monsters are very feminized.
Interesting. Yeah.
Medusa, the Xenomorph. But then like the dudes that I'm really into are like really bad. So I don't know how this works.
Well, I'm not taking an official Freudian stance, so I'm not going to do too deep of interrogation. Let's dig into that for an hour.
Next time. We can do that next time.
What about you, Scott?
In some ways, this is easy for me, but at the same time, I just share the feeling that I have 10 that I want to name. I'm going to pick 2.
Okay.
One, and anybody who's ever listened to me talk or read my stuff knows this, that I have a kind of lifelong obsession with Elsa Lanchester's bride in Wells' Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh yeah.
And part of that is it was a couple of things. One is that's an incredibly beautiful film. It's sort of this horror fairy tale comedy. And then there's just sort of the mystery and the tragedy of her character. I mean, we don't really see her until the last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
A little bit like Medusa, she has this strange beauty that is she is sort of this image of death and beauty all at once.
Yes.
Elsa Lanchester is of course a very attractive woman, but the makeup that Jack Pierce puts together makes her deeply scarred, and we know also what she is. So, and I also just think that just as I'm actually staring at a movie poster of her right now. One of the many representations of the Bride of Frankenstein sitting around me. But
nice.
She has always intrigued me, in part because of the sadness and the tragedy and just the whole kind of strangeness of the story. The other is this slightly odd. I have kind of American history is my thing, but I do have kind of a side interest in in Japanese history and culture, and so
Oh,
I'm a big
cool.
yokai fan. And one of my favorites is and I don't remember and wouldn't even try to pronounce the Japanese pronunciation, but she's a relatively new yokai known as the slit-mouthed woman.
Whoa.
And it's kind of she kind of emerged as sort of urban folklore or urban legend in the 1960s and 70s. And the story was it's really creepy. The story was a woman would and this is just kind of unintentionally contemporary, a woman wearing a mask. As of course this has long been common in the Asian world. A woman wearing a mask walks up to a young man on the street and asks, do you think I'm pretty? And actually, no matter how he answers this question, she pulls off the mask, and she has this sort of horrible scarred mouth. It's kind of vagina dentata.
Yeah, dig it.
And it's interesting to me. I mean, there was a film made about it in the 90s that I like a lot that is simply called Carved.
Oh, wow. I haven't seen that one.
I haven't either.
Okay.
It's a Japanese film. And,
okay.
It gives her a backstory in which, essentially this is a Medusa-like figure,
right?
Who has returned to seek vengeance after being, abused and assaulted in life. But I've just always been just kind of fascinated with her and kind of with that idea. It's obviously feeds into a lot of issues in the Japanese social context. In the period she emerged, there was a lot of discussion about culturally sanctioned sexual harassment of women in public, women on the subway, that kind of thing. And so just, the idea, even the question, do you think I'm pretty, that there's no right answer to, and this is this kind of vengeful spirit born out of social and domestic turmoil. It's just really, so I guess those are, I would say those are sort of my two favorite stories, but it's hard to say.
Oh, there's so many. Oh, that's a cool one. I'm gonna look her up.
Me too.
Because I don't know anything about that. Oh, awesome.
I feel terrible because I'm forgetting his name, but the author, it's simply called The Book of Yokai.
Okay.
Is where I encountered her. And he's written, I feel really bad because he's written several excellent books about Japanese folklore.
Cool. I'm going to find that.
The Slit-mouthed Woman and the movie Carved.
Wow. Awesome.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Reference. I'll try and link people to it as well.
Yeah. Awesome.
And then real quick, because I know you have to go, probably my two favorites are the Babadook.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I picked up on that.
I just love it. It's like richness as like a manifestation of grief and its complexity and how you can never really get rid of it, but you can just, it's like this old Buddhist parable about how instead of rejecting emotions, invite them to sort of sit beside you.
Exactly.
Where like you can never really tell grief to completely just heal like a wound. You just have to kind of invite it so it becomes this harmless version of itself that you can live with.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a great representation of that. And then I always go back to The Thing as well.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
That's probably my favorite monster movie of all time.
Okay, classic.
For many reasons. One of which being it's so particularly terrifying because you don't know what it is and it could be everything.
Yeah.
And you don't know if it's you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you even know? The characters in the film have no idea if they would even know if it was them or not.
I know.
And we never knew. We never actually find out.
Yeah. Yep. It's like the futility and the ambiguity. It's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
Yes. Right. So much more to say.
So much, yeah.
But to respect your time, I'll say that wraps up this episode. And both of you obviously are always invited on. So just to reiterate, fans of the show can find us on Spotify and iTunes, and follow us on Twitter at HFTDD. And I also encourage everyone to purchase for Sezin, American Monsters, Crime Rave, and for Scott. I can personally say that Monsters in America is an amazing book.
So amazing. So amazing.
Everyone should just buy it right now and be happy. Yeah. And Wasteland, I purchased last night, and I'm waiting for it, and I look forward to it.
Yep, same here.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Once more, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our guests this episode, and to all of you out there listening. From the dawn of recorded human civilization, we've been fascinated by monsters and the monstrous. They've inhabited our dreams and nightmares. They've been our protectors and our villains. They've symbolized our fears and vices, our hopes and potential. Fears of creatures and the night that nourishes them were key inspirations and fuel for the rise of human civilization, the need to get out of the shadows, behind the walls, and into the light. In many ways, understanding our monsters is an important part of understanding our world and ourselves. So thank you for taking this journey with us, we humanoids from the Deep Dive.